Good morning, 7th grade science students. I hope that you're doing well. Today, we will compare the DNA of different species to decide how closely related they are. To do this, we must look at the individual DNA bases on the same gene. These DNA sequences are for a gene that helps with cellular respiration. The more DNA bases, or letters, that they have the same, the more closely related two species are. The more differences in the DNA bases, or the letters, the less closely related two species are. Make sure that you take a few moments and read through the background information and directions. And let's take a look at what we want to do on our activity. You're going to compare DNA, which are represented by these different letters or bases in the DNA molecule, from one sample to another. Here we've got a sample labeled DNA sample 1. We're going to compare it to DNA sample number 2. You compare the first letter in sample 1, A, to the first letter in sample 2, A. They're the same, so we don't need to do anything. Now we'll compare the second base, A, C. C is different than this sample number 1, so we're going to highlight it. You go on through and continue to do the same thing until you've found all of the differences between line number 1 and line number 2. Over here in this next area, you can see we've got sample number 1. We're going to use that same sample. It's the same as you see over here. And now we're going to compare it to DNA sample 3. We'll do the same thing, compare the top letter to the bottom letter, so on and so on and so on, and highlight any differences that you find. Then you want to answer your questions about this first little section. Remember that the more numbers that are different, the less closely related two species are. After that little introduction section, you're going to compare DNA from different animals to human DNA. Again, this is on the same gene that does the same function in each species. But this time, your lines of DNA are not directly above each other. You have 2 lines of DNA for the dog and 2 lines of DNA for each and every other species. You're going to take a look at line number 1 in the human and compare it to line number 1 in the dog. For instance, AACGT. Here in line 1 of the dog, you have AACCA. So you'd highlight those last 2 because they are different than the last 2 in the line number 1 of the human. You'll do the same thing for each set there in line number 1, and then look at line number 2 to line number 2 in the human. In the human, you have GGTTC. In the dog, you have GATTC. This A should be highlighted because it's different than the letter in that spot in the human DNA. After you complete the dog, count up how many letters you highlighted and record it here in the number different from human. Then do the same thing for the monkey, the silkworm, the tuna, and the turtle. Compare the monkey to the human, highlight the differences, count them up and record them. Highlight the number of differences in line number 2 to the line number 2, count them up, and highlight them. After you have the count of how many different from the human, transfer that to your data table, and then assign a ranking. If they have the least number of differences, they should get number 1 because they're the closest to the human DNA. The species with the most number of differences should be linked number 5. So there should be a 1, a 2, a 3, a 4, and a 5. This is an important section that several students tend to forget. I want you to create a graph and insert it in here. Order your graph with number 1 on the left, number 5 on the right, and make bars going up for each number of difference. Then make sure you answer your questions, include examples from the evidence, and answer them in complete sentences. If you're interested to see how you're going to be graded, The rubric here at the end lays out every single thing that I'm going to be looking for in your assignment. Pay close attention to the requirements of a graph listed here, as well as some clues that might be found in the rubric to know if you have gotten all of the differences in the DNA bases. As always, if you have any questions or need extra help, don't be afraid to reach out and email your teacher. Thanks, and have a wonderful day.